The Hatfield-McCoy feud did not erupt in a vacuum. To understand the bloodshed that would come to define two families and divide a nation's imagination, we must first step into the Appalachian Mountains of the late 19th century. This was a place where the land itself shaped the character of its people: steep hills, dense forests, and isolated hollows that bred both resilience and suspicion. The Tug Valley, straddling the border of West Virginia and Kentucky, was not just a backdrop, it was a crucible where poverty, pride, and family honor clashed with devastating consequences. Life in the mountains was unforgiving. The soil was thin, rocky, and reluctant to yield crops. Families relied on subsistence farming, hunting, and timber, but even these were precarious. Hunger was a familiar guest at most tables. Economic insecurity was compounded by geographic isolation. Roads were few and unreliable, rivers often dictated travel, and neighbors could live miles apart. In such an environment, loyalty to kin was not optional, it was survival. A man's reputation, and by extension his family's name, carried more weight than any legal authority. Honor was currency, and to lose it was to risk being socially and economically destroyed. This culture of honor, deeply ingrained in Appalachian life, made disputes dangerous. A slighted word, a disputed boundary line, or a stolen animal could escalate into a vendetta. In towns where lawmen were scarce, families took justice into their own hands. Blood ties meant protection, but they also meant obligation. If one member of a clan was wronged, the whole family felt the wound. Revenge was not just expected, it was demanded. This cultural expectation set the stage for the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. The Civil War had deepened the fault lines. Kentucky was divided, with loyalties split between Union and Confederacy. West Virginia had been carved out of Virginia as a Union state, but Confederate sympathies ran strong in its southern counties. When the war ended, bitterness remained. Neighbors who had once fought side by side against outsiders now eyed each other with suspicion. Former soldiers carried their weapons and their grudges home. The Hatfields and McCoys lived only a few miles apart, but they might as well have been on opposite sides of an ideological canyon. Religion and tradition further reinforced the culture of loyalty. Most families were deeply Protestant, attending small churches where sermons emphasized sin, punishment, and redemption. Yet the concept of forgiveness often fell short when it collided with the realities of pride. To forgive an enemy was seen as weakness, to strike back was strength. Men were raised to protect their family name at all costs, while women were expected to uphold virtue and loyalty within the home. Against this backdrop, the Hatfields and McCoys were ordinary families living in extraordinary circumstances. They were not so different from their neighbors, but their choices, and their stubborn adherence to honor, would turn their private quarrel into America's most infamous family war. The American Civil War was more than a clash of armies, it was a civil rupture that reached deep into every hollow and homestead of Appalachia. For the Hatfields and McCoys, the war did not just pit Union against Confederate, it pitted neighbor against neighbor, cousin against cousin, and in many cases, even brother against brother. The Tug Valley, with its rugged border between Kentucky and West Virginia, was one of those frontiers where national conflict became painfully personal. It was here that the seeds of America's most notorious family feud were first sown. Kentucky, where the McCoys lived, was a border state torn in two. Officially loyal to the Union, its population was split down the middle. Families like the McCoys often sided with the Union cause, believing in the preservation of the United States even if it meant alienating their southern neighbors. Randall McCoy and his kin carried the Union flag in spirit, and their loyalties would later mark them as targets in a region dominated by Confederate sympathies. West Virginia, meanwhile, had been born in the fires of rebellion, breaking away from Virginia in 1863 to align with the Union. Yet in its southern counties, where the Hatfields lived, Confederate allegiance remained strong. William Anderson, Devil Anse, Hatfield, the charismatic and fiercely independent patriarch of the Hatfield clan, served in the Confederate Army under his uncle, Anderson, preacher Anse, Hatfield, and quickly gained a reputation as both a fighter and a leader. The war turned the Tug Fork into a no-man's land. Guerrilla bands roamed the valleys, sometimes fighting for ideology, other times for plunder. Skirmishes blurred the line between soldier and outlaw. Civilian homes were raided, crops were stolen, and property destroyed. For mountain families already living on the edge of survival, the war was a devastation they could scarcely afford. The violence hardened them, making vengeance and self-reliance second nature. Both Hatfields and McCoys experienced this crucible of war firsthand, and neither family emerged unchanged. Perhaps most significant was the emotional aftermath. When the war ended in 1865, peace was little more than a word in Washington. In Appalachia, grudges lingered like ghosts. Former Confederates returned home resentful and proud, unwilling to bow to a Union they still despised. Union loyalists came back embittered, many with personal losses that could not be mended. Families remembered who had fought for which side, and those memories became lasting scars. The Hatfields, aligned with the Confederacy, and the McCoys, tied to the Union, now stood on opposite sides of a chasm dug by war. It was not yet open conflict, but it was tension waiting for a spark. In hindsight, the feud might have been inevitable. Two proud families, living within shouting distance of each other, hardened by war and bound by a culture of honor, such conditions could not stay dormant forever. All it would take was one act of violence, one death that could not be forgotten, to turn suspicion into bloodshed. That act would come swiftly, and it would mark the first fatal chapter of the feud. The first true blood spilled in the Hatfield-McCoy feud came not from a quarrel over land or livestock, but from the lingering venom of the Civil War. The victim was Asa Harmon McCoy, a Union veteran and brother of Randall McCoy. His death in 1865, just as the war was ending, was the spark that foreshadowed the long years of bloodshed to come. In a region where honor was survival and loyalties defined identity, Harmon's fate was sealed the moment he chose the Union over the Confederacy. Harmon was no stranger to hardship. Unlike his more rugged brother Randall, Harmon was frail, often described as sickly, with ailments that kept him from working the land as hard as other men. Yet when war came, he enlisted with the Union Army, driven by loyalty to country and perhaps a need to prove himself. This choice placed him in direct opposition to the Hatfields, most of whom rode under the Confederate banner. Even more dangerous, his military service marked him out in a community where Union men were despised. When Harmon returned from the war, his situation was precarious. He came home not as a hero, but as a target. Many neighbors whispered that his presence was an insult to the Confederate men who had fought, and lost, so much. Devil Anse Hatfield, then a hardened ex-Confederate captain, represented the other side of this divide. While Anse himself did not personally kill Harmon, the men who hunted him were Confederate guerrillas tied to the Hatfield circle of influence. The story of Harmon's final days is as chilling as it is tragic. He was nursing injuries from his service and had taken shelter in a cave near his home in Pike County, Kentucky, fearing for his life. Legend has it that his mother tried to protect him, sneaking food and supplies to him under the cover of night. But word traveled fast in the mountains. On a cold January night in 1865, a band of Confederate Home Guards, sometimes referred to as Logan Wildcats, tracked him down. Harmon McCoy was shot dead in his hiding place, his body left as a warning to others who had chosen the Union side. The murder was not officially prosecuted, justice was scarce in the Tug Valley, but it was not forgotten. For Randall McCoy and his kin, Harmon's death was more than personal grief. It was a stain on family honor, a wound that demanded retribution. For Devil Anse and the Hatfields, Harmon's killing was not murder, it was war, and in war, enemies paid the price of their allegiances. Though the feud would not explode in earnest until years later, the death of Asa Harmon McCoy left an indelible mark. It was the first blood debt between the families, a memory that would smolder in the background, ready to be reignited when the next spark came. Every feud has its leaders, men whose strength, charisma, and sheer willpower shaped the destiny of their families. For the Hatfields, that man was William Anderson, Devil Anse, Hatfield. To outsiders, he was both feared and admired, a towering figure who commanded loyalty with ease, yet carried an aura of menace that earned him his unforgettable nickname. To his kin, he was protector and patriarch. To his enemies, he was a man to be reckoned with, a living embodiment of Appalachian toughness. Without Devil Anse, the feud may never have burned as fiercely as it did. Born in 1839 in Logan County, Virginia, modern-day West Virginia, Devil Anse grew up in the rugged Tug Valley. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, with piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through a man. From a young age, he developed a reputation as a skilled woodsman, a hunter who could track game for days, and a fighter who rarely backed down. Life in the Appalachians demanded resilience, but Anse had more than that. He had a natural leadership that others gravitated toward. When the Civil War broke out, his path to power accelerated. Anse enlisted with the Confederate Army and quickly rose through the ranks, serving as captain of the local militia. His unit, sometimes described as a band of Confederate guerrillas, gained notoriety for their effectiveness in the mountainous terrain. Anse's courage in battle was legendary, but so too was his ruthlessness. It was here that he earned his nickname, Devil Anse. Some claimed it came from his ferocity in combat, while others suggested it was his fiery temper. Either way, the name stuck, and it fit. After the war, Anse returned to Tug Fork with his reputation solidified. While many former soldiers struggled to adapt, he thrived. He became a prosperous timber merchant, hiring workers and amassing wealth and influence. Timber was the new currency of Appalachia, and Anse controlled much of it. His economic success gave him an edge over his neighbors, and his natural authority turned him into the unquestioned leader of the Hatfields. Men followed him not just out of loyalty, but out of necessity. Aligning with Devil Anse meant protection, jobs, and survival. Yet prosperity did not soften him. The memory of war, and the bitterness it left, made Anse wary of his Unionist neighbors, especially the McCoys. Harmon McCoy's murder had tied his name, fairly or not, to bloodshed, and though he denied direct involvement, whispers persisted. For Randall McCoy, those whispers were proof enough. To him, Devil Anse was the shadow looming over every injustice his family suffered. As the 1870s unfolded, Anse stood at the peak of his power, wealthy, respected, and feared. But with power came enemies. His growing dominance in the Tug Valley would soon collide with the pride of the McCoys, whose patriarch, Randall, was just as proud, and just as unwilling to bow. The feud had its two generals now. The battlefield was only a matter of time. If Devil Anse Hatfield was the iron fist of the feud, then Randall McCoy was its unyielding counterweight. Born in 1825 in Pike County, Kentucky, Randall grew up on the opposite side of the Tug River, in a world no less rugged than that of the Hatfields. Where Devil Anse commanded respect through power and prosperity, Randall embodied something different: stubbornness, pride, and a fierce devotion to family honor. Though he lacked Anse's wealth and charisma, his sheer determination made him a leader the McCoys would rally behind, especially when tensions with the Hatfields reached their boiling point. Randall's early life was marked by hardship. Unlike Devil Anse, who rose to prosperity through timber, Randall struggled to scrape a living from the unforgiving Appalachian soil. He farmed small plots, raised hogs, and hunted, but survival was always a daily battle. Poverty was not unusual in Pike County, but it weighed heavily on Randall, sharpening both his sense of pride and his resentment toward those who seemed to have more. This difference in status between the Hatfields and McCoys would later fuel their rivalry, as every conflict seemed to underline the gap between Anse's dominance and Randall's struggles. When the Civil War erupted, Randall aligned with the Union cause, a choice that set him at odds not only with his Confederate-leaning neighbors but also with his future adversary, Devil Anse. The McCoys' loyalty to the Union came at a steep price. The murder of his brother, Asa Harmon McCoy, in 1865, was a wound that never healed. For Randall, it was not simply a wartime casualty, it was murder. He believed that Devil Anse and his kin had orchestrated the killing, and though no charges were ever brought, the suspicion hardened into a lasting hatred. Randall's leadership of the McCoys was not as commanding as Anse's rule over the Hatfields. He was not wealthy, nor particularly charismatic. But he had something equally powerful in Appalachian culture, an unbending will. He demanded loyalty from his kin and inspired it by sheer stubborn pride. If the Hatfields had timber wealth, the McCoys had their name, and Randall guarded that name like a fortress. Any insult, real or imagined, was treated as a threat to the family's survival. This obsession with honor, however, also made Randall volatile. His pride left little room for compromise, and his grudges festered. To forgive was weakness, to forget was betrayal. It was this mindset that set the McCoys on a collision course with their wealthier, more powerful neighbors. In the Appalachian way of life, neither family could back down without losing face. And Randall McCoy, despite hardship and poverty, would never allow his family to bow before the Hatfields. By the late 1870s, the stage was set, two patriarchs, each proud, each unforgiving, standing on opposite sides of the Tug Fork. Devil Anse had power, Randall had pride, and both men were ready to defend their names at any cost. The powder keg was in place. All it needed was a spark. By the mid-1870s, long before the feud erupted into open violence, the Hatfields and McCoys were already circling each other with suspicion. It wasn't yet about bloodshed, it was about land, timber, and influence in a corner of Appalachia where survival hinged on who controlled the resources. In a region with little law enforcement and even less government oversight, power flowed not from courthouses but from land deeds, muscle, and family networks. And in this arena, the Hatfields and McCoys were destined to clash. The Tug Valley was rich in one particular commodity, timber. As America expanded, industrialization created a voracious appetite for lumber, and the great forests of Kentucky and West Virginia became prime targets. Devil Anse Hatfield, always ambitious, seized the opportunity. He built a profitable timber business, cutting deals with outside companies who paid handsomely for Appalachian hardwood. His enterprise gave him wealth and jobs to offer his kin, further strengthening his position as patriarch. To the Hatfields, this was prosperity earned through hard work and leadership. To the McCoys, it was a reminder of inequality, a daily sign that Anse's family thrived while theirs struggled to get by. Land ownership disputes added fuel to the tension. Boundaries in the mountains were often unclear, and surveys could be manipulated or challenged. Small pieces of property meant everything. They determined who could plant crops, graze livestock, or harvest timber. With Hatfields expanding their economic reach, McCoys grew increasingly suspicious that their rivals were encroaching on land they had long considered their own. Even a single acre could ignite anger in a culture where pride was as important as survival. On top of this simmered the personal grudges left over from the Civil War. The McCoys could never forget Asa Harmon's death, and whispers that Hatfield partisans had been involved. Meanwhile, the Hatfields carried their own bitterness, branding Union men like the McCoys as traitors who had sided with the enemy. Neither family could move past the war years, and every business success or social insult seemed to reopen old wounds. Honor, once again, magnified every slight. When a McCoy accused a Hatfield of cheating, lying, or stealing, it was more than an argument, it was a threat to family dignity. When a Hatfield dismissed a McCoy's complaint, it wasn't just arrogance, it was a declaration of superiority. In a land without strong courts, these disputes weren't settled with contracts. They were settled with fists, knives, and rifles. The 1870s ended with both families entrenched, each convinced the other was dangerous, dishonest, and determined to destroy them. It was not yet war, but the roots of the feud were spreading deep. The Hatfields had wealth, land, and power. The McCoys had pride, suspicion, and a burning memory of injustice. It was only a matter of time before one spark turned this rivalry into an inferno. By the late 1870s and early 1880s, the Tug Valley of West Virginia and Kentucky was no longer a remote wilderness untouched by outside forces. The timber industry had begun to creep into the mountains, bringing with it businessmen, loggers, and an economy that promised both opportunity and conflict. The Hatfields, living primarily on the West Virginia side, had taken full advantage of the timber boom. Devil Anse Hatfield, with his sharp eye for profit and leadership, built a thriving timber enterprise. His family controlled large tracts of valuable woodland, and his business dealings gave him connections to powerful figures outside the valley. Wealth, in turn, gave the Hatfields influence, something that stirred resentment among the poorer McCoys, who largely remained small farmers. The McCoys, though proud and hardworking, often struggled to make ends meet. Farming corn and tobacco on the rocky Kentucky hillsides was no easy task. Randall McCoy, the head of the family, saw his own fortune stagnate while his rivals across the Tug Fork seemed to prosper. To the McCoys, the Hatfields were not only competitors but symbols of inequality, neighbors who had gained power in a place where most men scraped by. The rising prosperity of the Hatfields contrasted starkly with the ongoing hardships of the McCoys, and bitterness began to brew in everyday interactions. But the timber boom did more than enrich one family over the other, it also brought legal disputes and political pressure. Land ownership was often poorly documented in Appalachia, and boundaries between properties were contested. Accusations of trespassing, theft, and exploitation ran rampant as new lumber contracts were signed and outsiders offered to buy tracts of woodland. The Hatfields, with their resources and connections, often came out on top in these disputes. The McCoys, lacking the same advantages, felt cheated and pushed aside. Beyond economics, the timber industry also hardened the social divide. The Hatfields were seen as modernizers, men with ambitions beyond subsistence farming, while the McCoys clung to the traditional ways of Appalachian life. This difference in outlook, while subtle, made each side view the other with suspicion. To the McCoys, the Hatfields were too close to outsiders, too willing to bend the old ways for profit. To the Hatfields, the McCoys were stubborn, jealous, and unwilling to adapt to changing times. It was in this climate of shifting wealth, simmering jealousy, and contested land that the famous feud began to take shape. While the seeds of conflict had been planted long before, the growing influence of the timber industry created new opportunities for division. Resentments that might have remained private were now given fuel by public disputes, whispered accusations, and the stark reality that one family was rising while the other seemed to be left behind. The feud was no longer a question of old Civil War loyalties or private slights, it was becoming a battle over money, honor, and survival in a changing Appalachia. The Tug Fork River, a winding, muddy waterway running along the border of West Virginia and Kentucky, became more than just a geographic marker, it became a symbolic fault line between the Hatfields and the McCoys. On one side stood the McCoys of Pike County, Kentucky, on the other, the Hatfields of Logan County, West Virginia. The river was supposed to be a boundary of peace, a natural separation between two families with simmering resentments. Instead, it became a line of battle, a constant reminder that even the smallest crossing could mean an invasion of pride, land, or honor. The McCoys saw the river as a protective barrier, believing their Kentucky soil shielded them from the long reach of Devil and Hatfield. But Hatfield men, seasoned woodsmen and hunters, could move across the rugged landscape with ease, their knowledge of the Appalachian terrain giving them an upper hand. This advantage meant that the river, far from being a shield, often became a weak spot where raids, ambushes, and violent confrontations were staged. Each side knew where the crossing points lay, and each crossing carried the risk of escalating the feud further. The river also symbolized the deep cultural divide. West Virginia, still a relatively new state, carried the proud defiance of Union loyalty during the Civil War, where the Hatfields had found strength. Kentucky, on the other hand, was deeply divided, with families like the McCoys holding on to Southern, Confederate sympathies. What had once been political differences had now hardened into cultural identities, with the river acting as the visible scar of that separation. Crossing it wasn't just a matter of geography, it was a challenge to one's loyalty and courage. Over time, Tug Fork became soaked in blood. Feud skirmishes often began with taunts shouted from opposite banks, escalating into gunfire across the water. Sometimes, men were caught in mid-crossing, their bodies later discovered downstream. Families living along its banks grew accustomed to the tension, raising children who knew better than to wander too close to the water alone. The river, once a source of life and sustenance for Appalachian communities, became feared, an unpredictable battlefield where death could come swiftly. The newspapers of the day seized upon the symbolism, dubbing it the dividing line of blood. For outsiders reading about the conflict, Tug Fork was no longer a forgotten backwoods river, it was the epicenter of America's most infamous family war. The Hatfields and McCoys had transformed it into more than a physical divide, it was now a moral and emotional one, a line where forgiveness ended and vengeance began. The more the Tug Fork River divided them, the harder reconciliation became. Each side saw the river not as a chance to separate and live in peace, but as a challenge, a dare to cross over and prove who truly held power in the hills. The summer sun of August 1882 was scorching over the Kentucky hills, but the tension in Tug Valley was far hotter. It was election day, a time when neighbors gathered not just to vote but also to drink, trade gossip, and sometimes settle grudges. Among the crowd that day were three McCoy brothers, Tolbert, farmer, and Bud. They were young, hot-tempered, and carrying the weight of years of resentment against the Hatfields. Also present was Ellison Hatfield, the younger brother of Devil Anse Hatfield. Ellison was a Civil War veteran, a tough fighter with a reputation for being fearless. Accounts vary on what sparked the conflict. Some say it was over a petty insult, others claim the McCoy brothers were already drunk and itching for a fight. But what's certain is that words turned into blows, and blows turned into blood. The McCoy brothers ambushed Ellison, stabbing him multiple times and shooting him in the back. Eyewitnesses recalled the brutal scene, saying Ellison collapsed in the dirt, bleeding heavily, yet still alive. Shock rippled through the crowd. This was no longer a family quarrel. This was war. Ellison was carried to a nearby house, gravely wounded. For days he lingered, fighting for his life, while the McCoy brothers were captured and held under guard. The law should have decided their fate, but in the violent world of the Appalachian frontier, justice often meant vengeance. Devil Anse Hatfield received word of his brother's condition, and his fury grew with every passing hour. On August 9, Ellison finally succumbed to his wounds. The news hit Devil Anse like a hammer blow. The Hatfields' grief turned instantly to rage. Without waiting for a trial, Devil Anse and his men dragged the three McCoy brothers to the Kentucky side of the river. There, in a chilling act of frontier justice, they tied the boys to papaw bushes and executed them with a volley of gunfire. The killing of Ellison Hatfield and the brutal execution of the McCoy brothers became the bloody spark that ignited the full-scale Hatfield-McCoy feud. From that moment on, the families were locked in a cycle of retaliation that would stain the hills with blood for nearly a decade. What had started as a drunken brawl had now escalated into something much larger, a battle where neither side would forgive, and neither side would forget. If the Hatfield-McCoy feud was a smoldering fire, then the love story of John Hatfield and Rosanna McCoy was the spark that nearly turned it into an unstoppable wildfire. John, the handsome, smooth-talking son of Devil Anse Hatfield, crossed paths with Rosanna, the beautiful but tragic daughter of Randolph McCoy, during a community gathering in 1880. From the very beginning, their romance seemed doomed, not because of who they were as individuals, but because of the blood that ran through their family's veins. To outsiders, the story might have sounded like a folktale version of Romeo and Juliet. Two young lovers trying to bridge an impossible divide. But unlike Shakespeare's tragedy, this was not a play. The stakes were real, and the consequences would echo across generations. When John and Rosanna fell in love, both families reacted with fury. The McCoys viewed Rosanna's betrayal as a stab in the back. How could she possibly give her heart to the son of the very man they despised most? Meanwhile, the Hatfields, though protective of John, weren't entirely pleased either. Rosanna was a McCoy, and that name alone carried the weight of suspicion and resentment. Yet the young lovers defied the odds and pursued their relationship in secret. Rosanna even went so far as to leave her family behind, moving in with the Hatfields for a time. That act alone enraged Randolph McCoy to no end. In his eyes, his daughter had not only dishonored her family but had chosen to stand with the enemy. For Rosanna, however, the choice was about love, a love that felt worth risking everything for. But as fate would have it, John's commitment to Rosanna wavered. Soon, he abandoned her and married her cousin, Nancy McCoy, instead. That betrayal shattered Rosanna's spirit. She returned to her family, heartbroken and disgraced, and the rift between the Hatfields and McCoys grew even deeper. What could have been a bridge between two families became another knife twisting the wound. The fallout from their relationship didn't just remain personal, it transformed into political ammunition. The McCoys now had one more reason to despise the Hatfields, while the Hatfields saw themselves justified in viewing the McCoys as enemies who could not be trusted. What should have been a love story of reconciliation instead became a tragedy that pushed the families closer to war. In many ways, the saga of John and Rosanna was the emotional heart of the feud. It showed the human cost of blind hatred and how love, instead of healing wounds, can sometimes deepen them when trapped inside an environment poisoned by pride and vengeance. Their short-lived romance was not just gossip for the hills of Appalachia, it became one of the defining moments that ensured the feud would spiral into violence. By the winter of 1887, the feud had grown so bloody that it seemed destined to end only in complete annihilation. The McCoys had already buried several loved ones, but nothing prepared them for the horror of New Year's Eve, 1888, the night the feud reached its darkest depths. That evening, a group of Hatfield men, led by Jim Vance and Cap Hatfield, rode out under cover of darkness. Their target, Randolph McCoy himself. In the dead of night, they descended upon the McCoy cabin on Blackberry Creek, setting it ablaze with fire and gunshots. Chaos erupted as flames engulfed the wooden structure. The family scrambled to escape, but bullets flew through the smoke. 2 of Randolph's children were brutally murdered, and his wife, Sarah, was beaten nearly to death. Somehow, Randolph managed to flee into the cold night with what remained of his family, but his heart was shattered, his home destroyed, his loved ones slaughtered, and his enemies showing no mercy. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. The brutality shocked the region, turning what had been seen as a bloody feud into something resembling open warfare. Even those who had sympathized with the Hatfields began to recoil at the savagery. For the McCoys, the massacre was a turning point. They vowed vengeance with a ferocity that matched, if not exceeded, anything before. The Hatfields, meanwhile, found themselves hunted not only by their rivals but also by the law, as authorities in both Kentucky and West Virginia could no longer ignore the escalating violence. This single night, this inferno of bullets and fire, became one of the most infamous chapters in Appalachian history. To many, it symbolized the point of no return, where hatred consumed families so fully that there was no longer room for reconciliation, only blood for blood. The Hatfield-McCoy feud reached its peak in January 1888, when a group of Hatfields, led by Cap Hatfield and Jim Vance, launched a brutal attack on the McCoy cabin in Pike County, Kentucky. The assault resulted in the deaths of 2 of Randolph McCoy's children and left his wife, Sarah, severely beaten. Randolph himself narrowly escaped the attack. In response to this atrocity, a posse led by Pike County Deputy Sheriff Frank Phillips was formed to apprehend those responsible. The posse crossed into West Virginia, capturing several Hatfield family members and supporters. Jim Vance was killed during the operation, and 9 individuals were arrested and brought to trial in Kentucky. The legal proceedings that followed were groundbreaking. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Mahon v. Justice that the Hatfield defendants could be tried in Kentucky, despite the crimes occurring in West Virginia. This decision marked a significant moment in the application of interstate legal principles. The execution of Ellison Cottontop Mounts, one of the convicted Hatfields, in 1888 was the only legal execution resulting from the feud. His hanging in Pikeville symbolized the end of the violent conflict between the 2 families. This section illustrates the shift from vigilantism to formal legal proceedings, highlighting the role of law enforcement and the judiciary in resolving the long-standing feud. By the mid-1880s, the feud had evolved into a cycle of blood vengeance that seemed unstoppable. Each killing demanded another, and every act of violence left both families hungrier for retribution. After the brutal execution-style killing of Ellison Hatfield's attackers, the McCoy clan became more determined than ever to strike back. The violence was no longer about justice, it was about pride, survival, and reputation. In the Appalachian Hills, honor was sacred, and to let an enemy's insult go unanswered was seen as weakness. Both families were trapped in an endless spiral, where even children grew up with hatred in their veins. During this period, both sides turned to ambushes and midnight raids. The Hatfields, led by Devil Anse, were skilled woodsmen who used the rugged terrain of West Virginia to their advantage. They launched surprise attacks, knowing every hollow and mountain path. The McCoys, meanwhile, sought allies from nearby Kentucky counties, swelling their numbers for open confrontations. This constant back and forth left the borderlands in a state of terror. Innocent families caught in the crossfire often had to flee their homes, and many townspeople began to curse both clans for bringing so much death and destruction to the Tug Valley. What began as a single argument over a hog had now become a war that threatened to consume entire communities. Would anyone, or anything, be able to break this chain of revenge before both families destroyed themselves completely? The violence reached a chilling new height on August 7, 1882, in what became known as the Papaw Massacre. It began with a drunken brawl at an election day gathering, an event meant for celebration but destined to turn into a nightmare. Ellison Hatfield, brother of Devil Anse, got into a fight with three McCoy brothers, Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr., the sons of old Randall McCoy. The fight spiraled out of control. Ellison was stabbed multiple times and shot in the back, left bleeding in the dirt. Word quickly spread, and before long, Devil Anse himself arrived with armed Hatfields. They captured the three McCoy brothers and dragged them across the Tug Fork into West Virginia. For a moment, there was hope for mercy. The Hatfields vowed they would not act until they knew Ellison's fate. But when word came back that Ellison had died from his wounds, everything changed. Devil Anse gave the order, justice would be delivered without a court, without mercy. The McCoy brothers were marched to a pawpaw thicket along the riverbank. There, tied to pawpaw bushes, they were riddled with bullets in a brutal execution. The killings shocked even longtime Feud watchers, for this was no simple shootout, it was a deliberate massacre, carried out as retribution. The Pawpaw Massacre cemented the Feud's reputation as one of the bloodiest in American history. From this moment forward, the Hatfields and McCoys were no longer just neighbors feuding over land and livestock. They had become enemies locked in a war of annihilation. The question haunting Appalachia now was simple: how much blood would be enough? The turning point that escalated the Hatfield-McCoy feud into full-scale bloodshed came on Election Day in 1882 along the Tug Fork River. What began as a political gathering soon turned into a deadly clash fueled by liquor, family rivalries, and long-simmering hatred. Ellison Hatfield, brother of Devil Anse Hatfield, got into a violent confrontation with three McCoy brothers, Tolbert, Farmer, and Randolph Jr. What started with insults and punches quickly spiraled into a brutal stabbing and gunfire. Ellison was left bleeding with 26 stab wounds and a bullet in his back. The McCoy brothers were immediately captured by the Hatfields, but instead of turning them over to the law, Devil Anse decided to wait and see if Ellison survived. For 2 days, the brothers were held prisoner while doctors tried to save Ellison's life. When news came that Ellison had died from his wounds, Devil Anse made a fateful decision. He ordered the McCoy brothers to be tied to pawpaw bushes and executed by gunfire. This single act, known today as the Tug Fork Massacre, transformed the feud into an unstoppable cycle of revenge. Both families felt justified in their actions, and the violent retaliation that followed would plunge the region into nearly a decade of bloodshed, raids, and ambushes. White right pointing backhand index. This moment wasn't just murder, it was a declaration of war between the Hatfields and the McCoys, one that would draw in neighbors, friends, and even the government. By the winter of 1887 to 1888, the feud had spiraled into an endless cycle of blood and vengeance. But nothing shocked America more than the New Year's Night Massacre, one of the most infamous chapters of the Hatfield-McCoy War. On a freezing January night, a band of armed Hatfields, led by Jim Vance and Cap Hatfield, crossed the Tug Fork and stormed the McCoy cabin while the family slept. The Hatfields opened fire and set the house ablaze, trapping the McCoys inside. In the chaos, Randolph Ole Ranell McCoy, the family patriarch, managed to escape into the woods. But his wife, Sarah McCoy, was brutally beaten and left for dead. Even worse, 2 of their children were killed in the flames and gunfire, while the rest barely escaped with their lives. The news of the massacre spread like wildfire, shocking newspapers across the country. To many outsiders, this was no longer just a private feud, it had become an all-out war, turning Kentucky and West Virginia into a bloody battlefield. The New Year's attack marked a terrifying escalation. It revealed the sheer ruthlessness of the feud, where no one, not even women or children, was safe from revenge. For the McCoys, the night became a symbol of betrayal and brutality. For the Hatfields, it was seen as grim justice for years of provocation. White right pointing backhand index. From this moment forward, the feud was no longer just family against family, it was about survival. Lawmen, bounty hunters, and even state militias would soon be dragged into the fight. By 1890, the Weatherstone name had become both a curse and a legend. But nothing prepared the Appalachian people for what happened next. Caleb Weatherstone, the eldest surviving son of the clan, known for his iron grip over illegal timber routes, suddenly vanished without a trace. At first, locals believed it was just another feud gone wrong. But then, something stranger surfaced. Caleb had last been seen walking into the dense Tennessee woodlands, accompanied by 2 hired men. Neither he, nor the men, were ever seen again. Their camp was found days later, burned to ash, with only Caleb's pocket watch left behind, still ticking. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered he had been betrayed by his own blood. Others swore they saw strange men in black coats riding through the mountains the night he disappeared. Theories exploded. Was it a rival clan's revenge, or had Caleb uncovered something darker that powerful people wanted buried forever? The disappearance shattered the family's power structure. With Caleb gone, the Weatherstones were suddenly leaderless, paranoid, and on the brink of collapse. But the truth of what happened that night in 1890? It was buried so deep in Appalachian silence that even now, historians can only speculate. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a ghost story etched into blood and smoke. 2 years after Caleb's mysterious vanishing, the Weatherstones were spiraling. Leaderless, divided, and paranoid of each other, they became more dangerous than ever. What began as whispered suspicion soon exploded into open violence, not just within their clan, but across state lines. By 1892, reports surfaced of entire wagon convoys ambushed along the Tennessee-Kentucky border. Farmers, merchants, even lawmen vanished on those winding mountain roads. Witnesses who survived swore the attackers wore strange family insignias, carved into their rifles and knives, the Weatherstone mark. But here's the twist, multiple factions began using it. It became impossible to tell if the crimes were done by the true Weatherstones or by imitators, rival clans, mercenaries, or perhaps even corrupt officials exploiting the family's fearsome reputation. The Appalachians descended into chaos. No traveler could trust a stranger. Every shadowed campfire on the trail looked like a trap waiting to spring. Newspapers sensationalized the events, calling it the cross-state feud, describing how dozens of families fled their homesteads, abandoning generations of land. But beneath the hysteria, researchers found patterns. The same routes Caleb had once controlled were now flooded with violence. It was almost as if his disappearance had unleashed a hidden war, one designed to erase all traces of whatever secrets he had been protecting. This wasn't just a feud. It was the birth of something much bigger, a multi-state criminal network hiding in plain sight. By the late 1880s, the Hatfield-McCoy feud had gone far beyond a private family conflict. Newspapers across the United States, from New York to Chicago, began reporting on the violence with sensational headlines. Journalists painted the feud as a symbol of lawlessness in Appalachia, branding the families as savages of the mountains. The public was both horrified and fascinated. For many Americans living in cities, the feud seemed like something out of a Wild West story, except this was happening in the hills of Kentucky and West Virginia. The media exaggerated details, sometimes inventing rumors of blood oaths, ambushes, and secret family codes. This turned the feud into a spectacle that the nation couldn't stop reading about. The attention put pressure on state officials, who realized the conflict was no longer just a local matter. Kentucky's governor accused West Virginia of protecting the Hatfields, while West Virginia leaders fired back, calling Kentucky's claims political theater. What began as a family war was now threatening to escalate into a border dispute between two states. The newspapers only fueled the fire, spreading every new killing and trial across the country. Some reports even compared the feud to the Civil War, saying it divided towns, churches, and entire communities. The Hatfields and McCoys were no longer just fighting each other, they had become unwilling actors in a national drama. Would the media frenzy force the families to stop? Or would it push them deeper into violence to defend their names before the entire nation? By the early 1890s, the feud had reached the courtrooms. After years of bloody ambushes and retaliations, the law finally began tightening its grip on both families. One of the most infamous moments came with the arrest and trial of Ellison Cottontop Mounts, a mentally challenged young man tied to the Hatfields. Cottontop was accused of participating in the brutal New Year's Night Massacre of 1888, when members of the Hatfield clan set fire to Randolph McCoy's cabin and killed 2 of his children. The attack shocked the nation, and Kentucky demanded justice. Though many argued that Cottontop was manipulated and not fully aware of his actions, he became the scapegoat for the entire feud. His trial was a spectacle. Crowds packed the courtroom, eager to see whether justice would finally bring an end to the bloodshed. The prosecution portrayed Cottentop as a ruthless killer, while the defense insisted he was incapable of plotting such violence on his own. But the jury's decision reflected not only the crime, but the country's demand for closure. Cottentop was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution in 1890 drew thousands of spectators. For many, his death symbolized the feud's last great chapter of violence. It was a grim public performance, meant to satisfy a nation that had followed every bloody twist of the Hatfield-McCoy saga. But the trial didn't just punish Cottentop. It marked a turning point where law and order finally began to replace revenge. Other family members faced prison terms, property seizures, and heavy legal costs. The feud that had started with pride and land now ended in chains and gallows. Yet even as justice was served, one question lingered: was Cottentop truly guilty, or was he just a tragic pawn sacrificed to end America's most infamous family war? In the summer of 1587, more than 100 English settlers crossed the Atlantic with high hopes of building a new life on the shores of North America. They landed on Roanoke Island, in what is now North Carolina, full of ambition and determination. But within just a few years, the colony would become one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. When supply ships returned to check on the settlers in 1590, they discovered something terrifying: the colony had vanished without a trace. The houses were dismantled, no signs of struggle were found, and no graves marked the ground. The only clue was a single, haunting word carved into the wood of a tree: Croatoan. This strange message has puzzled historians, archaeologists, and conspiracy theorists for centuries. Did the settlers move to Croatoan Island, home to a nearby Native American tribe? Were they absorbed into the local population, leaving behind their English identity forever? Or was it something darker: starvation, conflict, or even a supernatural fate that wiped them out completely? What makes Roanoke so chilling is the silence of history. Usually, when a colony fails, there are at least stories of famine, conflict, or migration. But in this case, there were no eyewitness accounts, no survivors, and no letters carried home across the sea. It was as if an entire community simply evaporated. Some theories suggest the settlers tried to sail back to England on their own and perished at sea. Others argue they may have been killed by hostile tribes or Spanish raiders. Yet none of these explanations has ever been proven. Modern archaeological digs have uncovered hints, fragments of European pottery, tools, and weapons in areas linked to native settlements, but nothing that definitively explains what happened to the men, women, and children of Roanoke. The mystery continues to fuel books, documentaries, and even horror stories that imagine the colony falling victim to curses, supernatural forces, or something much worse lurking in the wilderness. For Americans, the story of Roanoke is more than a historical puzzle. It's a reminder of how fragile life was for the first pioneers, and how quickly even the best-laid plans could collapse under the weight of the unknown. The settlers of Roanoke dreamed of a new world, but instead, they became legends, their disappearance echoing across more than 4 centuries. To this day, the lost colony remains a haunting chapter of history. A community of over 100 souls simply walked off the pages of time, leaving only a carved word as their ghostly signature. Roanoke is not just a mystery of the past, it is a warning that some secrets are destined never to be solved. Beneath the rugged Appalachian Mountains lies a chilling secret that has been whispered about for over a century. When the coal mines were sealed in the 1960s, the official story claimed it was due to safety hazards. But locals, miners' descendants, and even former officials have suggested something far darker: that these mines were used for secret human experiments, and the evidence was deliberately buried under layers of stone, ash, and silence. Imagine descending into a mine shaft not just for coal, but for something else. Workers spoke of rooms that didn't appear on official maps, sealed chambers reinforced with steel doors. Some swore they heard screams echoing through the tunnels, sounds too human to ignore, yet too horrifying to question. The few who asked too many questions were said to be transferred, or worse, disappeared entirely. One miner's diary, discovered in the belongings of his grandson, paints a haunting picture. He wrote about crates being delivered at night, guarded by armed men who weren't miners but soldiers. The crates never contained coal tools, only strange glass containers and medical equipment. "We dig," he wrote, "but not for coal." We dig graves for the living. This entry has fueled endless speculation about whether industrial workers, injured, sick, or simply expendable, were used as test subjects for chemical or medical experiments. Researchers who have tried to study these claims point out that the Appalachian mines had strategic importance during the Cold War. The remoteness, secrecy, and lack of oversight made them perfect locations for covert operations. A declassified government memo from the 1950s mentions underground facilities for classified research in industrial zones, though it never named specific sites. Was this simply coincidence, or a smoking gun? Adding to the mystery are the disappearances. Families recall loved ones who went to work one day in the mines and never came home. The official explanation was always collapse or gas leak, but bodies were rarely recovered. Skeptics argue that accidents did happen in mining towns, but the sheer number of cases, paired with the secrecy, points to something much darker. Today, paranormal investigators and historians alike are drawn to these abandoned shafts, trying to uncover the truth. Many claim to feel sudden drops in temperature, hear metallic clanks deep below, or even capture ghostly whispers on recorders. Whether these are restless spirits of miners or echoes of experiments gone wrong, no one knows for certain. But one thing is undeniable: too many stories align, too many details overlap, for this to be dismissed as simple folklore. The sealed mines of Appalachia may look quiet now, but under the dust and rubble lies a story too dangerous to tell openly. Were these simply coal mines, or were they laboratories of human suffering, buried forever to keep their secrets hidden? Perhaps the most heart-wrenching detail about the Callahan family saga lies not in the adults who wove webs of violence, but in the children who were trapped in that environment. When modern researchers revisit the 1872 Tennessee tragedy, one of the most haunting aspects is how deeply the youngest members of the family were scarred by the crimes, secrets, and silence surrounding their household. The Callahan children, some barely old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong, grew up in a home where cruelty was normalized. According to fragments of oral history and scattered newspaper reports, these children were often forced to watch acts of violence. It wasn't just the brutality itself, but the lesson they absorbed, that silence equaled survival. They learned early that to question the elders, to reveal the truth, or even to speak too loudly about what they had seen could result in punishment. Imagine the psychological prison that creates. For these children, fear became a constant companion. Records show that several of the younger Callahans were taken in by distant relatives after the family's exposure. Yet whispers followed them wherever they went. In small Appalachian communities, reputation was everything, and the Callahan name carried a stain that could never be scrubbed clean. These children bore the weight of sins they never committed. Teachers, neighbors, and even playmates looked at them with suspicion, as if evil itself might be inherited through blood. For the rest of their lives, they lived under the shadow of crimes they were powerless to stop. Psychologists who study generational trauma often use cases like the Callahans to explain how cycles of abuse and secrecy pass down. A child raised in fear may grow into an adult who replicates that same environment, sometimes unknowingly. This tragic inheritance ensures that even if the original crime ends, its echoes continue for decades. And so it was with the Callahans. Some of the surviving children grew into adults who isolated themselves, mistrusting outsiders. Others tried to start fresh in far-off towns, changing their names, pretending to come from different families. But whispers have long memories. In Tennessee folklore, a Callahan descendant was always one of them, no matter how far they ran. The tragedy here is not just historical, it forces us to ask timeless questions. How many families, even today, bury their secrets so deep that children carry wounds into adulthood? How many lives are shaped not by their own choices but by the sins of those who came before them? In the case of the Callahan children, history teaches us a painful lesson: the weight of family sins is never easily lifted. And for some, innocence is lost long before they ever have the chance to claim it. Buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies a tale that feels like it was ripped straight from a horror novel. In 1913, the sleepy coal mining town of Kmart, West Virginia, was struck by a mystery so chilling that locals still whisper about it today: the unexplained disappearance of nearly an entire shift of miners inside a forgotten shaft. The mine had already been considered dangerous. Decades of poor ventilation, collapsing beams, and rumors of gas pockets made it a place where only the desperate dared to work. On the morning of June 17, 1913, 37 miners clocked in for what should have been an ordinary day underground. By sundown, when families gathered near the mouth of the shaft waiting for their loved ones, only 3 men emerged, covered in soot, gasping for air, and unable to speak a word of what had happened inside. When townsfolk demanded answers, the mining company swiftly sealed the shaft. They claimed it was due to toxic gas levels, but locals weren't convinced. The survivors, still trembling and unable to piece together coherent explanations, were quietly relocated by the company within a week, never to be seen again. Some whispered they had gone mad. Others believed they had been silenced. Adding to the mystery, strange sounds were reported near the sealed entrance for weeks afterward, distant hammering, muffled voices, and what some claimed was a chorus of screams echoing from beneath the earth. Families begged the company to reopen the mine and search for bodies, but officials refused. With no death certificates, no burials, and no official explanation, 34 miners were simply erased from history. Decades later, urban explorers stumbled across the collapsed shaft. Inside, they reported finding old mining helmets scattered in odd patterns, as if the men had dropped everything and fled in terror. Others spoke of claw marks along the stone walls far below, as though the miners had tried desperately to dig their way out. Paranormal investigators who visited the site claimed their equipment malfunctioned, compasses spun wildly, and EVP recordings captured faint voices crying, "Get out!" But perhaps the darkest twist is this: records show that the Weatherstone family, already infamous in Appalachian lore for their shadowy operations, had financial ties to the Kamo mine at the exact time of the disappearance. Some researchers believe the miners uncovered something they were never meant to see, something connected to the hidden network of tunnels and secret operations rumored to stretch across Appalachia. Whether the men were victims of corporate greed, hidden conspiracy, or something far stranger buried beneath the mountains, one thing is certain: 34 fathers, brothers, and sons entered that shaft and were never seen again. Their families carried the grief for generations, and to this day, the mountains of West Virginia hold tight to their secret. By the late 19th century, the Appalachian railroads were seen as lifelines of progress, but beneath the clattering wheels and clouds of smoke, darker whispers spread. Workers disappeared at alarming rates along certain stretches of track, most often at night. Official reports called them accidents: a slip beneath a train wheel, a fall into a ravine, a collapse inside a tunnel. But locals knew better. These deaths were too frequent, too conveniently explained, and always seemed to involve men who had recently spoken of unfair wages, brutal supervisors, or of running away to expose the truth. One particularly infamous case occurred in 1888, when 5 miners-turned-rail workers were reported killed instantly in a tunnel collapse near Hazard, Kentucky. The company immediately sealed the tunnel, citing danger. Families were told their loved ones' bodies couldn't be recovered. But rumors spread that the tunnel had never collapsed at all, that the workers were silenced because they planned to reveal unsafe conditions and the company's corruption. A few weeks later, strange lights were seen flickering from the sealed tunnel entrance, followed by screams that echoed through the mountains at night. Some claimed it was the spirits of the murdered men crying out for justice. Others whispered of secret work continuing inside, far from prying eyes. Researchers today have found old ledgers hinting that the company paid large, silence fees to certain foremen immediately after the so-called accident. The tunnel remains sealed to this day, its mystery preserved behind iron gates and warning signs. For the families, there was no closure, only unanswered questions. Were these truly accidents, or executions disguised as industrial misfortune? The railroads brought prosperity, but the blood on the tracks tells a story of men used, discarded, and buried beneath steel and stone. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. Many of these accidents may have been deliberate cover-ups, ensuring that the voices of the exploited would never reach the world beyond Appalachia. And each sealed mine, each abandoned tunnel, may still hold bones and secrets that history has tried to bury. The deeper the investigation went, the darker the discoveries became. Whispers began circulating about hidden graves scattered across the hills of Tennessee, unmarked burial sites that seemed to connect directly back to families like the Callahans and their associates. Locals claimed that travelers who vanished without a trace often ended up in these shallow graves, buried beneath layers of soil and silence. What made the situation chilling wasn't just the bodies themselves, but the pattern they revealed, burials placed at strategic distances, almost like a map, marking the family's territorial control. Farmers digging wells stumbled upon bones. Children playing in the woods uncovered scraps of clothing that belonged to people who were reported missing years ago. Yet every time evidence surfaced, it mysteriously disappeared. Local sheriffs either ignored it or claimed the remains belonged to long-forgotten Civil War soldiers. But the people who lived there knew better. They whispered about nighttime wagon rides, where lanterns glowed faintly as bodies were transported to their final resting place under the cover of darkness. What struck historians later was the systematic precision of it all. These weren't random killings, this was organized, efficient, and terrifyingly methodical. Each burial told a story of how far the family's network of silence reached. If you asked too many questions, you didn't just risk uncovering the truth, you risked becoming the next body buried in those woods. The Appalachian landscape itself became a co-conspirator. Dense forests, rugged mountains, and endless caves provided the perfect hiding grounds. Once someone disappeared, the wilderness swallowed them whole, leaving behind little but rumors and fear. Some even suggested that the Callahans had specific, death sites, locations long associated with executions, where the earth had been disturbed dozens of times over decades. Locals avoided these places, claiming the air felt heavier there, like the land itself carried the weight of the crimes committed upon it. But the real horror was the community's complicity. Many people suspected the truth, but silence meant survival. To speak against the Callahans was to sign your own death sentence. And so, the graves remained hidden, scattered across Appalachia like cursed monuments to the lives stolen. Each unmarked grave wasn't just a burial, it was a warning. A silent message that power and fear ruled here, not law or justice. When modern researchers finally pieced together the evidence, it became clear. The Callahan family hadn't just thrived through violence and secrecy, they had built an empire of fear, cemented in the soil itself. And even today, some believe there are countless graves still waiting to be discovered, hidden beneath the thick Appalachian wilderness, holding stories that will never be told. Just when investigators thought they had mapped every dark corner of the Weatherstone family empire, a new lead emerged, an abandoned farmhouse deep in the Tennessee backwoods. At first glance, it was nothing more than rotting wood, shattered windows, and weeds swallowing the foundation. But locals swore the place had a pulse of its own. They whispered about lights flickering in the upstairs windows, even though the house had no electricity for decades. Hunters claimed they heard voices chanting inside, long after sunset. And every so often, the earth near the cellar would sink slightly, as if something buried beneath was shifting. The farmhouse had once belonged to a lesser-known branch of the Weatherstone clan, a family of 4 who vanished without a trace in 1884. Neighbors assumed they'd fled the law. But the sheriff at the time wrote in his diary, later uncovered by historians, that the cellar contained boxes unfit for human eyes. That single line reignited curiosity more than a century later. When urban explorers finally broke inside, what they found wasn't dust and decay, it was a frozen time capsule. Children's toys arranged neatly in a circle, plates still stacked on the dinner table, and upstairs, a rocking chair that swayed by itself as if someone had just risen from it. But the cellar was the true nightmare. It wasn't just a storage space, it was a labyrinth. Narrow brick tunnels spread beneath the house, connecting to hidden chambers that smelled of damp soil and rusted iron. Inside, explorers discovered crude wooden boxes, each one large enough to fit a person. The boxes weren't empty. They were lined with stains and claw marks. Experts later suggested these weren't coffins, they were cages. Even worse, faint symbols were carved into the walls, identical to those found on stones in other Weatherstone properties across Appalachia. It was as if every location formed part of a secret map, each site feeding into a bigger, unseen network of control. The farmhouse wasn't just a ruin. It was evidence. evidence that the Weatherstones operated not as a scattered family of criminals, but as a coordinated force with rituals, rules, and punishments carved into stone and flesh alike. The question that haunted researchers was simple yet terrifying: if the Weatherstones had built networks like this across multiple states, how many more of these underground chambers were still waiting to be uncovered? And worse, what if some weren't empty? The farmhouse didn't give answers. It gave warnings. When investigators returned to the abandoned Weatherstone mine decades after its closure, they didn't expect to uncover anything extraordinary. To most people, it was just another Appalachian coal shaft sealed off in the 1960s when the industry collapsed. But history has a way of leaving clues buried in silence, and the Weatherstone family had a reputation for turning ordinary places into unholy sanctuaries. What was found inside was not just coal dust and rusting tools, it was a graveyard of secrets. Hidden beneath the collapsed tunnels were ledgers, carefully preserved in waxed cloth, listing names, dates, and payments. These weren't simple mining records. They were detailed logs of men who had gone missing after disputes, accidents, or late-night shifts where they never came back out. The handwriting matched that of known Weatherstone patriarchs, proving beyond question that disappearances tied to the family weren't rumors, they were part of a systematic operation. More disturbing than the ledgers were the remnants left behind. Bones, scattered and fused into the rock, suggested that workers who resisted or threatened to expose the Weatherstones were quietly disposed of underground. Locals later recalled how entire families packed up and left town overnight after a relative vanished in the mines. The mine wasn't just a workplace, it was a prison where the Weatherstones ruled like feudal lords. Once sealed, the mine became a tomb, holding within it the physical evidence of a family empire built not on coal, but on fear. Even decades later, the air inside carried an unsettling chill, as if the very earth remembered the crimes committed beneath it. The discovery shook researchers, because it connected directly to unsolved cases across Appalachia. Names from the ledgers matched those of missing persons reports filed in towns hundreds of miles away. Somehow, the Weatherstones had created a network, luring desperate men with promises of work, only for many to disappear without a trace. The mine, once a symbol of livelihood, had instead become a machine of erasure. What's most chilling is that, had the mine not been sealed, these records might have been destroyed, leaving the truth buried forever. Instead, the Weatherstone name was carved even deeper into America's forgotten history, not just as criminals, but as architects of silence, hiding their darkest operations beneath the mountains themselves. Even after the so-called civilized world crept deeper into the Appalachian Mountains, leaving behind railroads, industry, and schools, one thing never seemed to die: the old superstitions. Outsiders often laughed at them, calling them backward beliefs, but to the people who lived there, these traditions carried survival, fear, and identity. Generations passed down warnings of witches who lived in the hollows, curses whispered into the wind, and signs in the forest that told of looming danger. For many, these weren't just ghost stories, they were a way of life. The Appalachian Mountains were rich in folklore that blurred the line between faith, survival, and fear. A crow circling overhead might mean death was close by. A dog howling at night could be a bad omen for the family. Some even claimed that if a clock stopped without reason, someone in the house would soon die. Families passed down these lessons as if they were as important as farming techniques or medicine, teaching children to read not only books but the hidden codes of the land. One of the most feared tales was that of the Anse, restless spirits said to roam the woods and abandon cabins. Parents warned children never to wander into certain areas after sunset, lest they fall prey to the Anse. Some homes painted their porch ceilings a sky blue color, called Haint Blue, believing it would confuse spirits and keep them from entering. To the untrained eye, this looked like simple decoration, but to mountain families, it was spiritual protection, as important as locking the front door. But not all superstitions were about ghosts. Some were rooted in herbal medicine and survival. For instance, a woman might warn her daughter not to plant crops when the moon was waning, or to gather herbs only at dawn for their full strength. These rules carried both mysticism and practicality, aligning farming with lunar cycles often yielded healthier harvests, while collecting herbs early ensured freshness. Outsiders scoffed at this, but the mountain people knew their traditions kept them alive in a land where medicine and supplies were scarce. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, as outsiders began to document these customs, stories of Appalachian superstition spread far beyond the mountains. Folklorists called them quaint, while preachers called them sinful. Yet, despite the criticism, these beliefs endured. They gave identity to people who felt abandoned by government, mocked by city folk, and misunderstood by the outside world. Even today, echoes of those old beliefs remain. Some families still tell their children not to whistle at night, believing it calls evil spirits. Others leave coins on the windowsill when someone dies, an offering to guide the spirit on its way. In this way, superstition wasn't just a relic, it was a stubborn piece of culture that refused to vanish, no matter how much the world outside changed. High above the Tennessee valleys, where the mist clings to the trees like restless spirits, lies a ridge the locals call Callahan's Rest. But rest is the last thing that place has ever known. Beneath its soil, archaeologists and fortune-seekers alike have unearthed shallow graves, bones cracked and scattered, their stories silenced long before they could ever be told. For decades, whispers have claimed that the Callahan family used the ridge not as farmland, but as a graveyard, an unmarked, forgotten cemetery where inconvenient truths were buried under moss and dirt. The first official discovery came in 1924, when a hunter stumbled upon what he thought was a deer's skeleton. Instead, he found the jawbone of a man, still bearing a gold tooth. From there, a chain of horrifying revelations followed. Shallow pits holding multiple bodies, all marked by trauma, broken ribs, fractured skulls, and in some cases, clean-cut marks on the bone that suggested deliberate dismemberment. This was not just death, it was execution, carried out with precision. What terrified investigators most was not the bones themselves, but the arrangement. Some graves contained whole families, children, mothers, and fathers, stacked together, as if wiped out in a single night. Others were lone travelers, stripped of belongings, buried face down in the earth as though shamed even in death. The eerie consistency in these burials hinted at ritual, or at least a code the Callahans followed, a way of erasing lives without leaving a trace of individuality behind. Local folklore tied these discoveries to disappearances stretching back half a century. Merchants who vanished while passing through, farmhands who left town promising to return but never did, even lawmen who entered Callahan territory and were never seen again. The ridge became a silent testimony to all those missing souls. Yet, despite the growing evidence, nothing concrete could ever be proven. The Callahans' influence ran deep, sheriffs turned blind, records went missing, and journalists who tried to dig too deep often found themselves intimidated into silence. To this day, the ridge stands untouched. Locals avoid it after dark, swearing that strange lights flicker between the trees and that whispers echo from the earth itself. Some claim the Callahans still guard the graves, their descendants ensuring the dead never reveal their secrets. Others say the land itself is cursed, rejecting anyone who tries to disturb it. One thing remains certain, the Callahan Ridge is not just a burial ground. It is a monument to terror, a chilling reminder of how many lives can vanish when a family, cloaked in fear and power, controls the narrative. And for every bone unearthed, there are countless others still waiting, hidden beneath the earth, their stories silenced, but not forever. The Appalachian Mountains, with their breathtaking landscapes and tight-knit communities, also carried some of the darkest tales of blood feuds in American history. Long before organized crime families made headlines, small mountain clans waged silent wars that lasted decades. These were not simple disputes over land or livestock, they became generational curses, where children grew up with hatred in their veins, taught from birth to despise another family's name. One of the most infamous examples is the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a story that grew into American folklore. Beginning in the mid-1800s, what started as a dispute over a stolen hog spiraled into a cycle of killings, revenge plots, and ambushes that left dozens dead. For years, the families lived in a constant state of paranoia. Men carried rifles to church, children were warned never to cross into enemy land, and marriages between the families were seen as betrayals punishable by death. Appalachia became a place where justice was not served by the law, but by the barrel of a gun. But the Hatfields and McCoys were not alone. Across Appalachia, smaller feuds quietly consumed entire communities. Some were sparked by political differences during the Civil War, others by economic rivalries in coal mining towns. In many cases, these feuds outlived their original cause. The younger generations didn't even know why the hatred existed, only that their grandfathers had bled for it, and they were expected to do the same. The impact of these feuds on Appalachian society was devastating. Entire towns were paralyzed by fear, trade routes collapsed, and schools became battlegrounds for children raised to see one another as enemies. Outsiders often avoided these regions, leaving families more isolated, which only deepened their loyalty to blood ties and vendettas. Churches tried to mediate peace, but forgiveness was often impossible when graves kept filling with the names of fathers, brothers, and sons. In many ways, these feuds reflected a darker truth about Appalachia. When the law was too far away, survival depended on loyalty and vengeance. Honor was not just a word, it was a code. To break it meant eternal shame. To uphold it often meant bloodshed. Today, historians view these blood feuds as both tragedies and cautionary tales. They remind us how quickly a single spark can ignite years of violence when poverty, isolation, and pride mix together. And while the Hatfield-McCoy feud eventually ended, its legend still lingers, a symbol of how Appalachia carried not only beauty but also generational scars carved into its people. As generations passed, stories of the strange and often tragic families of Appalachia took on a life of their own. Oral traditions in the mountains had always been strong. Tales were passed down not in books but in fireside conversations, community gatherings, and whispered warnings to children. Over time, fact and fiction intertwined so tightly that the truth became nearly impossible to separate from myth. Entire lineages came to be remembered not for who they truly were, but for the legends that grew around them. One such recurring motif in Appalachian folklore was that of the cursed bloodline. Families who had suffered repeated tragedies, whether from disease, violence, or mysterious disappearances, were said to carry a curse. In isolated towns where superstition blended with daily survival, these curses were believed to linger across generations. Neighbors would whisper about families who couldn't escape their fate, and outsiders would avoid their homesteads, fearing bad luck might spread to them. Another key aspect of folklore was the association of these families with the land itself. In mountain culture, land was not just property, it was identity, heritage, and survival. When families lost their land, whether through debt, legal trickery, or sudden disaster, their names often became attached to ghost stories. Locals would say that certain valleys echoed with the voices of the dispossessed, or that the woods near abandoned cabins carried an uneasy silence. These places became markers of memory, preserving the legacy of forgotten families in ways that were more spiritual than historical. Children especially were raised on these tales. Parents used them as warnings: don't wander too far into the hollow where the cursed ones lived, don't take kindness from strangers who come from families you don't know, don't break the unspoken codes of loyalty and respect that bound the community. These rules were meant to protect, but they also ensured that stories of old families, whether true or not, were never forgotten. Interestingly, researchers today see these stories as reflections of the region's struggles with poverty, isolation, and survival. The cursed family was often just a poor family that had endured too much loss, while the haunted homestead was usually just another abandoned cabin left behind when people moved north for work. Yet, for mountain people, these stories were never just stories, they were living reminders of resilience, misfortune, and the fine line between survival and collapse. In this way, folklore became the immortality of forgotten families. Even when no gravestone remained, no census record survived, and no king was left to tell their story, the mountains themselves carried their memory in the form of tales, warnings, and whispers. It was a strange kind of eternity, one that blurred the line between history and legend. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Weatherstone family had become less a clan of flesh and blood and more a whispered legend that clung to the remote valleys of Appalachia. Their once dominant shadow began to thin, yet the echoes of their deeds refused to die. What lingered was not so much their physical presence but the myths, half-truths, and cautionary tales woven into the identity of the mountain people. Locals claimed the Weatherstones had not vanished at all but had simply learned the value of invisibility, merging into small towns under false names, abandoning open brutality for quiet manipulation. Others believed they had been systematically destroyed by rival clans, swallowed by the same cycle of bloodshed they once thrived upon. Yet the truth, like most things tied to their name, was always just out of reach. Generations grew up with their parents warning them never to stray too deep into certain hollows, where lantern lights flickered in windows of long-abandoned shacks. Hunters swore they stumbled upon ritual markings carved into trees, and on moonless nights, some spoke of hearing voices chanting in the woods, voices that carried the same strange cadence of the Weatherstone prayers. Farmers reported livestock disappearing with surgical precision, and many muttered that the Weatherstone still took what they believed was theirs. Whether coincidence or lingering presence, these stories turned the family into something more than human, a symbol of predatory endurance, a ghost story that both frightened and fascinated. At the same time, their story began to capture the attention of outsiders, historians, journalists, and even folklorists eager to document the darker corners of Appalachian heritage. For these seekers, the Weatherstones represented more than just a criminal family. They symbolized the enduring tension between civilization and wilderness, law and lawlessness, progress and tradition. Some writers painted them as villains, architects of cruelty who thrived on exploitation. Others cast them as tragic antiheroes, shaped by poverty and isolation, fighting for survival in a world that never welcomed them. Both views held pieces of truth, yet neither could fully explain the strange grip the Weatherstone name had on the imagination. Even now, remnants of their influence persist. Court records from nearby counties mention mysterious deaths tied to families who shared distant Weatherstone blood. Oral traditions keep their memory alive, retelling stories around campfires where children listen wide-eyed. And perhaps most haunting of all are the genealogical traces, dozens of mountain families whose lineage, if carefully untangled, reveals Weatherstone ancestry. Some descendants embrace this past, claiming it with pride as proof of resilience. Others bury it, terrified that the sins of their ancestors still stain their blood. In truth, the Weatherstone legacy may never be fully untangled. Their power lies not in what can be proven, but in what can never be erased. They endure as a riddle, a reminder that the line between myth and reality is often paper-thin. To speak their name in hushed tones is to admit a deeper fear, that some shadows in history never truly fade, they only change shape. Imagine surviving the storm, but being the only one left to tell the tale. That was the fate of one man whose story would shake the nation to its core. For decades, the Callahan family's dark legacy was whispered about in taverns, passed like a curse between generations, but nobody ever lived to give true testimony. Until now. An elderly man, his hands trembling as though carrying the weight of centuries, came forward with a confession that froze everyone in the room. He claimed he had once been taken in by the Callahans as a child laborer, fed scraps, beaten daily, forced to dig in the cursed soil of Tennessee's backwoods. But here's where it gets insane. He didn't just describe cruelty, he described rituals. At midnight, he said, the family would gather around a pit where bones glistened in the torchlight. They chanted in a language he couldn't understand, their shadows stretching like monsters on the cabin walls. And the worst part? He swore he saw them bury victims alive, neighbors who had simply vanished without a trace. Nobody believed him at first. His voice cracked, his story sounded too grotesque, too cinematic. But then, he showed them something. From a hidden pocket, he pulled out a rusted key and a fragment of wood carved with the Callahan family crest. This, he whispered, is all I escaped with. Experts analyzed the relic, and the results were chilling. The wood matched perfectly with materials found in the ruins of the Callahan property. The crest? An exact copy of symbols etched into hidden panels within the cabin. Suddenly, his story wasn't just rambling, it was evidence. But here's the twist, if his words were true, it meant the Callahans weren't just killers. They were part of something bigger, an organized system of fear, violence, and ritual spanning across the Appalachian wilderness. Historians argued for weeks. Was this man the long-lost missing child rumored in local legends? Or was he a master storyteller seeking attention in his final days? The townspeople didn't care. They listened in silence, their faces pale, as his tale painted the Callahans not as humans, but as predators hiding in plain sight. And as he finished, the old man leaned in, his eyes burning with the fire of memory. "They're gone," he said, "but their blood runs in others. You think the Callahans are dead? They are not. They just changed names. Moved towns. They are still out there." The room went silent. A chill swept over the crowd. And in that moment, everyone realized the Callahan horror wasn't over. It had only just begun. Every tale, no matter how dark, reaches a point where it must either fade into silence or transform into something far more dangerous: legend. The story of the hidden families, the missing workers, and the vanishing towns does not end with official reports or dusty archives. No, it ends where truth and myth collide, in the unsettling realization that some secrets refuse to be buried. Think about it: entire communities erased, records destroyed, witnesses silenced. Yet, whispers still crawl through the cracks of history. Locals claim they've seen figures standing in the fog, carrying the same surname as those long-dead families, still walking the earth as if time itself has bent to their will. Were these descendants, still bound by blood to the ancient crimes? Or were they simply shadows left behind, fragments of a legacy that should have ended long ago? The government, the corporations, even the townsfolk, everyone had something to lose by digging too deep. That's why these stories were rewritten, reshaped, and locked away. But history has a cruel habit of resurrecting itself. Just when you think the past is gone, it claws back, demanding to be heard. And this isn't just about one family or one region, it's a pattern. Hidden cemeteries, sealed-off mines, erased maps, all pointing to something bigger, darker, and far more organized than anyone dares admit. Imagine standing in a town square, knowing beneath your feet lies an entire network of bones, secrets, and betrayals. Every step you take is on ground paid for in silence. Every building is a monument to those who vanished without a trace. And still, the stories persist, not in the newspapers, but in hushed voices, in midnight conversations, in warnings passed down from the old to the young: do not go where the earth remembers. The final shadow is this: the possibility that what we've uncovered is not a closed chapter, but the beginning of a cycle repeating itself. History doesn't vanish. It waits. It lurks. And sometimes, it disguises itself so well, entire generations mistake it for progress. But behind the new roads, the factories, the smiling faces, the same hunger exists, the same greed, the same cruelty, the same machinery of silence. So here's the question that chills every spine: if the families who started it all never truly disappeared, then where are they now? And worse, what are they planning next? The story does not die here. It lives on in you, in me, in anyone daring enough to peel back the mask of history. Because once you've glimpsed the shadow, you can never unsee it. The Callahan family's story, rooted in the Appalachian Mountains of Tennessee in 1872, is more than just another dark tale of crime and secrecy. It is a chilling reminder of how entire legacies can be swallowed by shadows. By the time whispers of their deeds spread beyond the tight mountain communities, the family had already carved themselves into history as both outcasts and enigmas. To this day, no one can say with certainty whether the Callahans were masterminds of organized criminality, unfortunate victims of circumstance, or a mixture of both. Local legends claim that the family maintained a network stretching beyond Tennessee: hidden roads, secretive pacts with other clans, and coded messages passed through wandering traders. Some insist that the Callahans were not acting alone, that they were simply one piece of a greater Appalachian underworld that thrived in silence. Others argue that their story became exaggerated by frightened townsfolk, who saw in them the perfect scapegoats for disappearances, debts unpaid, or grudges unresolved. Yet what remains undeniable is the imprint they left on generations who followed. Even after official investigations waned, whispers persisted in churchyards, schoolhouses, and campfire gatherings. Parents warned their children not to wander too far into the woods where the Callahans once lived, telling tales of spirits, traps, and restless ghosts who guarded the family's secrets. Amateur historians and modern researchers have since uncovered curious records, names linked to the Callahans appearing in distant counties, strange deaths never solved, and newspaper clippings hinting at something far larger than one isolated family could manage alone. The legacy of the Callahan mystery lies not just in the crimes attributed to them but in the way their story reflects the darker side of human survival. In a world where the line between law and outlaw was blurred, families like theirs often became both protectors and predators, ensuring survival in ways that would forever stain their memory. To this day, true crime enthusiasts, historians, and storytellers return to the Callahan saga, each trying to pull truth from the tangle of myth. But maybe that's the true power of their legacy: it refuses to die. Whether the Callahans were masterminds of a criminal web or victims of folklore spun out of fear, their story echoes across Appalachia like a haunting song. The deeper you dig, the murkier it becomes. And perhaps that's the final twist of the Callahan family's tale: their greatest crime wasn't just what they did in 1872, it was making sure no one would ever know the full truth.